Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about something that's going to make you rethink those small moments in life that seem insignificant. Sure, you know those little things you think, whatever, doesn't matter. But we're exploring John Calvin's return to Geneva, and as you're going to find out, he really did not want to go back.
Was not happy about it.
Oh, he was not happy. And it's kind of crazy to think that history could have been so different because of, you ready for this?
An artichoke.
An artichoke.
Yeah, an artichoke. So the source that we're using for this deep dive is from 2024, and the author,
Oh, they really?
yeah, they dove into this thing called the Artichauts Crisis, which, I mean, it sounds kind of quirky, I'll admit that, but you're going to see how much it impacted religious history. It's really amazing.
You know, what's really interesting about this is that a lot of people, they think of Calvin and they think of him as like this powerful guy right from the start, ruling Geneva. But it's just not true. It's so much more complex than that. Yeah, most people don't know that when Calvin first got to Geneva back in 1536, it was tense.
Very tense.
Yeah, it wasn't, a smooth transition or anything.
No, not at all. And then it got worse in 1538 when he got banished.
Oh, yeah.
That was a big deal. I mean, he got kicked out because he wouldn't follow the Bernese Reformation practices. He just flat out refused.
And he even said, if we had served men, we would have been poorly recompensed, but we serve a great master who will reward us.
Oh.
You can just hear, like, the conviction in his voice, right?
Yeah, you can.
Like, he's not messing around.
Definitely a stubborn guy.
So now we've got Calvin banished from Geneva, seemingly happy to be away from all the drama, and that's where the whole Artichoke Crisis thing comes in. Can you set the scene for us? What was happening in Geneva that made this, this seemingly random event so important?
Sure. So Geneva at this time was kind of caught between two big forces in the Reformation. You've got the Bernese and the French, and then within Geneva you have this powerful group called the Artichauts, and they were all about aligning with Bern, and they wanted a more, how do I say this, a more relaxed approach to religious reform.
Ah, so that's different from Calvin.
Oh, yeah. Very different from what Calvin and his followers wanted. And what's crazy is that their downfall, it wasn't some big theological debate or some power struggle. It was a diplomatic mission to Bern that went completely south, all because of bad timing.
Okay, now you have to tell me more about this diplomatic blunder.
Right.
I mean, you don't hear about artichokes getting mixed up in religious history every day.
I know, it's pretty funny when you think about it, but the timing was just awful. So the Bernese authorities, they were busy with their own stuff, you see.
Oh, like what?
Well, they were working on their own constitution, and to be honest, they saw Geneva as kind of a pain.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So when these Genevan envoys show up hoping to, get closer to Bern and make their alliance stronger, the Bernese basically ignored them.
Oh, man, talk about an epic fail. I bet those envoys were mortified.
I can only imagine.
What happened when they went back to Geneva? Like, how did this rejection change things?
Well, when they slinked back to Geneva, it created this huge power vacuum. The Artichauts, they'd put all their eggs in the basket, and now they were weak, and nobody trusted them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And who do you think was ready to step in and take advantage of the situation?
Oh, I bet I know this. Calvin's supporters.
Bingo. They saw this as their chance to get back in the game and push for their vision of Geneva.
Okay, so that sets the stage for Calvin's return. Bingo, he's not exactly jumping for joy about going back to Geneva. In fact, from what I hear, his reaction was more like, oh no, not again. I mean, he even said that Geneva was like a torture chamber. Why was he so against going back? Was it personal? Or was there something more to it, like theological or political reasons?
Well,
Yeah,
it was all of that mixed together, really.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you got to remember his time in Geneva the first time was a total mess. I mean, constant pushback, getting kicked out.
Yeah.
He finally found some peace and purpose in Strasbourg. Going back to all that drama, and he just didn't want him.
Yeah, I get it.
But there's more to it than just that,
Yeah.
Calvin's beliefs played a big role, too.
Ah, okay.
He had very specific ideas about how the church should be run, how society should function, and he knew that Geneva was nowhere near ready for that.
Oh, so going back would be a fight.
Yeah, huge fight, and he wasn't sure he had the energy for it,
That makes sense. So we've got this reluctant hero, right, being called back to this place he dreaded.
It makes me wonder, how did they convince him to go back? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like asking someone to go back to a restaurant that gave them food poisoning.
Right.
Like, no
Well-
thanks, I'm good.
Well, they really pulled out all the stops.
Okay, how so?
It was like a 16th century PR campaign,
Wow.
tons of letters and stuff.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They appealed to his sense of duty, saying that Geneva desperately needed him to become a true center of Reformed Christianity.
So they laid it on thick.
Oh, yeah. They even got big names from all over the Reformed world to write to him, begging him to come back, praising his intelligence and his leadership.
Yeah, so they really pulled out all the
Yeah.
stops. Oh, yeah, it was a smart move, and it worked.
Wow, so they basically guilt-tripped him into coming back.
Well, maybe guilt tripped is a bit harsh,
Okay.
but they definitely played on his conscience and his commitment to the Reformed movement. And eventually, Calvin saw it as a call from God, a duty he just couldn't ignore, even though he really didn't want to go.
Wow, that's amazing. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? This guy who wanted nothing to do with Geneva ends up being like the face of the city.
Yeah.
But you said earlier that he didn't actually have any political power, right?
Nope.
So how did he have such a huge impact on Geneva without being in charge?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. You see, Calvin went back to Geneva, not as a politician, but as a pastor, a teacher.
Oh,
He focused on building a strong church, educating people, and instilling a strict moral code.
got it.
His sermons were powerful, his writings were influential, and he set up this system of church discipline that really affected daily life in Geneva.
So he was in charge without being in charge.
Exactly. So he might not have had the official power, but his influence was everywhere in Genevan society.
Yeah, like soft power.
Exactly.
He changed the culture, the way people thought, the whole fabric of Geneva through his teaching and his personality.
Exactly. And that's why this whole Artichauts crisis is so important. Because if those envoys had gotten Bern on their side, if the Artichauts had stayed in power, Calvin probably would have stayed in Strasbourg.
Ah.
And Geneva could have been totally different.
Mm.
Maybe more tolerant,
Yeah.
less strict in its Protestantism.
Yeah.
Who knows? The Reformation might have gone in a completely different direction.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about.
Hey, now.
This whole story just shows how these seemingly small events can have huge ripple effects,
True.
They can shape not just individual lives, but the entire course of history.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think about those what-if moments in your own life, doesn't it?
Yeah, like what if you'd made a different choice
Yeah.
or taken a different path?
Right. I mean, who knows what could have happened?
Exactly. That's what's so cool about history. It reminds us that the world is this crazy web of interconnected events.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the connections are obvious, but other times, like with John Calvin and the whole artichoke thing, they're totally unexpected.
Yeah, totally unexpected. Well, that's all for part one of our deep dive into the Artichauts Crisis and the surprising return of John Calvin to Geneva. It's a story of unintended consequences, reluctant heroes, and the power of ideas. Who knew a vegetable could be so important in shaping history? Join us for part two, where we'll dive even deeper into this fascinating story. See you there.
Yeah, it was kind of a mix of everything, really.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to remember his first time in Geneva was rough. Constant pushback, getting kicked out. He finally found some peace in Strasbourg, going back to all that drama. And on top of that, Calvin was a man of deep conviction.
Yeah.
He had very specific ideas about how the church should be run, how society should function. And he knew Geneva was nowhere near ready for that.
So it would be a fight.
A huge fight.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was sure he wanted to fight it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. So we've got this guy, Calvin, who really doesn't want to go back to Geneva, but they're begging him to come back. It's like asking someone to go back to a restaurant that gave them food poisoning.
Exactly. It's like, no thanks, I'm good.
Right. But they must have really wanted him back. How did they convince him?
Well, they launched this huge campaign to get him back.
Like what?
Think of it like a 16th century letter-writing campaign. They appealed to his sense of duty, saying that Geneva needed him to become this beacon of Reformed Christianity.
So they were laying it on thick.
Oh, yeah. They even got big names from all over the Reformed world to write to him, urging him to reconsider, praising his intelligence and his leadership.
Wow. So they really pulled out all the stops.
They did, and it worked.
So they basically guilt-tripped him into coming back.
Well, guilt trip might be a little strong, but they definitely played on his conscience and his dedication to the Reform movement. And in the end, Calvin saw it as a call from God. A duty he couldn't ignore, even though he really didn't want to go.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? This guy who wanted nothing to do with Geneva ends up becoming synonymous with the city. And a lot of people think of him as this powerful ruler, but you said he didn't have any official political power, right?
Nope.
So how did he shape Geneva so much without actually being in charge?
That's the really interesting part. Calvin returned to Geneva not as a politician, but as a pastor, as a theologian.
I see.
He focused on building a strong church, educating people, and instilling a strict moral code.
Okay.
His sermons were powerful, his writings were influential, and he established this system of church discipline that really impacted daily life in Geneva.
So even though he wasn't officially in charge, his influence was everywhere.
Exactly.
Mhm.
He might not have had the official power, but his influence permeated every aspect of Genevan society.
It's like soft power, right?
Exactly. And that's why this whole Artichauts crisis is so important. Because if those envoys had gotten Bern's support, if the Artichauts had maintained their power, Calvin probably would have stayed in Strasbourg.
Huh.
And Geneva could have gone in a completely different direction. Maybe they would have been more tolerant, less strict in their Protestantism.
And maybe the whole Reformation would have been different too.
Exactly. The ripple effects are huge.
It's amazing how these seemingly small events can have such a big impact. They can shape not just individual lives, but the course of history. It really makes you think about those what-if moments in your own life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Like, what if you'd made a different choice or taken a different path?
Exactly. It's mind-blowing to think about all the possibilities.
That's what makes history so fascinating. It reminds us that the world is this complex web of interconnected events. Sometimes the connections are clear and obvious, but other times, like with John Calvin and the Artichauts Crisis, they're totally unexpected.
Totally. And who would have thought that an artichoke could play such a pivotal role in shaping history?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, what would Geneva be like today, or even the whole Protestant world, if those envoys had managed to, charm the Bernese authorities. What if this whole artichoke crisis thing had never happened?
Yeah, it's a fun thought experiment, right?
Totally.
It's impossible to say for sure, but we can guess, right? If Geneva had gotten closer to Bern, they might have ended up with a more, laid-back religious culture.
Oh.
Maybe not so strict. Maybe it wouldn't have become like the Calvinist capital that we know.
Yeah.
Maybe it would have been this totally different intellectual hub where all these different Protestant ideas could just, chill together.
Yeah, that's a cool thought. And without Geneva as this, Calvinist stronghold, would the Reformation have played out differently across Europe?
Oh, yeah.
Would other countries have, adopted different models of religious reform?
Absolutely.
We're talking about a domino effect that could have changed the whole religious and political landscape of Europe.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Totally. It just shows how interconnected history is, These small events, these little things that seem insignificant at the time can have these huge consequences that echo through time.
Yeah, it's like the butterfly effect.
So what's the takeaway from all of this? I mean, is it just a reminder that sometimes history just happens? It's all just a bunch of coincidences and bad timing? Or is there something deeper here about how individuals can shape events, even when they don't want to?
I think it's a bit of both. There's definitely an element of chance of things just happening, but there's also this message about the impact of our choices.
Oh.
Even when we make them reluctantly or when we're scared. Calvin didn't want to go back to Geneva, but once he did, he totally changed the city and the whole movement.
Yeah, and it reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference, even when things are tough, even when it feels like we're facing a torture chamber of challenges. Maybe those challenges are what shape us, what push us to leave our mark on the world.
Yeah, maybe that's the biggest lesson from this whole artichoke crisis.
Right.
A reminder that history isn't set in stone. It's a tapestry woven from choices, chance encounters, and, even the occasional artichoke.
I love that. Well, there you have it, folks, our deep dive into the Artichauts Crisis and John Calvin's surprising return to Geneva. It's a story of unintended consequences, reluctant heroes, and the enduring power of ideas. Who knew a vegetable could be so important in shaping history? Next time you're enjoying a delicious artichoke, maybe you'll think about all the twists and turns of history and those what-if moments that shape our world in ways we never expect. Thanks for joining us.